movies don't really make sense to us and resonate. Stories don't really make sense and resonate with us unless they follow that basic biblical paradigm.
So what happens when the church no longer sits at the center of culture? How do we make sense of a world where millions of people are leaving the pews, and yet they're wondering what is meaningful about life? How can I understand true beauty? Where is the truth? Well, this is where cultural apologetics comes in. And that's what we're going to talk about today. This is the Truth Changes Everything podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jeff Myers. One of my life mottos is you need old people. I am constantly trying to get wise counsel. And so I just call up people who are thinking and talking about things I think are really interesting and important, and I record it. And that's what this show is. My guest today is Collin Hansen. He's the vice president for content and the editor-in-chief of the Gospel Coalition. He hosts a podcast called Gospelbound and has written and contributed to many books, including Timothy Keller, His Spiritual and Intellectual Formation, and Rediscover Church, Why the Body of Christ is Essential. He's a member of Redeemer Community Church in Alabama and an adjunct professor at Beeson Divinity School, where he also co-chairs the advisory board. Let's welcome Collin Hansen to the Truth Changes Everything podcast. Collin Hansen, welcome to the Truth Changes Everything podcast.
I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to our conversation because of a new book of essays that you've edited called The Gospel After Christendom. And in your work with Gospel Coalition, I know you're dealing with a lot of young people who are deconstructing or in their process of questioning. Tell us a little bit about that title, because I think that's fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Well, Christendom is something that has been dominant in Western culture for almost about 1,500 years or so. Just think about the fusion between the church and government. In the United States, that's been a little bit different, but we all know that the church has had a huge influence on our government during, for most of its history. But we definitely sense that period is over, both officially and unofficially. While in the United States, the church continues to have a good bit of influence, there's also a tremendous amount of opposition as well. And there's no sense that Christians in any way are dominating all different spheres of life the same way that they had in Christendom. In fact, we're getting to a point where Christians will be kind of a basic majority of the population in the United States, but nowhere near those dominance numbers. So that's a transition period. But I think one of the reasons that so many people are deconstructing, not just of their Christian faith, but also of their confidence in Western culture, is because it's not just Christianity and Christendom that we are moving past. It's that we don't know where we're going, because the Enlightenment was also a major part of our last several centuries. This idea that science can solve all the problems that we can't understand from God. Well, that's also in transition as well. And so there's a lot more people than ever that are questioning, how do we even know what truth is? How do I even believe in what I'm seeing? I mean, gosh, just consider the role of artificial intelligence when it comes to that. People are wondering, is this the right economic system anymore? People are wondering, well, if we don't get truth or meaning from religion or from Christianity, where do I find it? Do I find it in myself, or what is my identity? So all these different things are up for grabs, and certainly that's can be disturbing for Christians and leading to a good bit of deconstruction. But it's also a time of transition for everyone, where a lot of people are asking the same questions of who am I, what is my purpose, where am I going, and who can I trust, and what can I trust in? So it's a pretty big transitional moment.
It's a transition that we've seen take place in Europe over the last several decades, probably beginning almost immediately after World War II. Maybe that's from the cynicism of, war is terrible, and where could a good God possibly be in all of this? But the United States of America was very different for a very long time.
Yeah.
At the same time, we have now this rising generation, Gen Z, that doesn't have the same respect for, revealed religion. I'm not sure that's the right term. Standardized religion, just sort of the general religious impulse. Is America, is it kind of a cultural Christianity that's fading away? Or is it an actual loss of understanding of the truth of the gospel?
Yeah, I had just recorded a commentary that was investigating the differences between secularism in Europe versus secularism in the United States. And there's a lot of different reasons for those differences that are in some ways converging now. They're looking more similar than they had, say, a couple decades ago. But the main reason that they're looking more similar now is because of the main difference with the United States going back to World War II. The United States emerged from the Second World War as one of two global superpowers. We had overtaken the British Empire in that regard, as well as the rest of Europe outside of the Soviet Union. So World War II was a triumphant experience. Also, even with the attacks on Pearl Harbor, our homeland was not devastated the same way that Europe was, and certainly much of Asia as well. So those were a couple factors of why it was different. And then also the emerging threat immediately under nuclear, with a nuclear battle potentially hinging or coming, was the Cold War. So, and what was the definition of the Soviet Union? Well, it was an atheist state. So there was certainly even a post-war, I mean, we know about the baby boom and things like that, but there was a post-war revival of organized religion in general that included Christianity. Think of people like Billy Graham as an example. So as you fast forward, the real change comes in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. And that's when the Cold War is officially ended. And now all of a sudden, if the United States is not defined against the Soviet Union, well, then who are we? Then you jump forward 10 years, and what do you get 10 years after the end of the Cold War? You get the September 11th attacks. And the response to the September 11th attacks is not necessarily an anti-Islamic response, but an anti-organized religion response. Anyone who's a supposed extremist, which would have included the way that a lot of evangelicals were categorized, many of whom who had influence in the Bush administration at that time. So what Gen Z is inheriting in terms of a lot of skepticism toward organized religion is not something that originated with them. It's something that came through these generations. And by the time that it came down to them, the trust, especially 9/11 happened around the same time that the internet became widespread in American homes. A majority did not have the internet in their homes until 2000. You just see a widespread skepticism in general, a sense that I'm going to make up truth, I'm going to pursue this for myself, and overall just a distrust of almost every authority and every institution in American life, and organized religion was a major part of that.
I think that's a really powerful response. I'm just really drilling down on the word skepticism for a minute, because I'm working with a generation of young adults who seem skeptical at one time, but extremely naive at the same time. They're skeptical of what they view as authority structures, but they're not nearly skeptical enough of people who claim a victim status and operate from that perspective.
Yeah. That's such a good observation. Yeah, and not nearly skeptical enough of ourselves. So part of what we lay out in this book is a theological retrieval of the theology of Augustine from the early church, 300s and 400s, Augustine of Hippo in North Africa. I mean, there's a sense in which, as Christians, we recognize that we have a lot more reason to be optimistic because all people are made in the image of God, and there's a common grace everywhere we look. At the same time, we're fallen. We have every reason to be skeptical, as the prophet Jeremiah says, to distrust our wicked hearts, and even to be chastened about that, even when we become Christians. So, yeah, what we're trying to advocate in this book, and hopefully to encourage Gen Z and others, is to be, yes, you have every reason to be skeptical about a lot of things, starting with yourself, right, but including institutions that are made of fallen people. And yet, at the same time, very optimistic that God is at work even when you can't necessarily perceive it.
This is really good. I'd love to dig into some of the essays and just have you comment on them from the book. You mentioned in the book that there are 40 million young people who've left the church in the last 25 to 30 years, if I have that right. So from your perspective, what are the unique challenges, but also opportunities? Because I think what I'm hearing you say is, if we're skeptical of structures of authority and not skeptical of our own nature, then we've missed the tension that actually is kind of a creative tension for the building of societies.
Yeah. Yes.
But what are the challenges and opportunities that you see? I'm thinking of students I'm sending off to college campuses specifically.
Yeah. Well, those 40 million Americans who have left the church the last 25 to 30 years, certainly most of them now are not young, and they weren't necessarily young when they had left. In fact, one of the more recent polls I saw indicated that, and I don't know if I can confirm this otherwise, but showed that the generation that's most likely to go to church, percentage-wise, is Gen Z. So it's possible that we're even beginning to see some of the reversal, or at least a stabilization where we're not continuing to see drop-off of the faith. And that could speak then directly into your question about why there might be optimism, why there might be hope here. So one of the major challenges in that 40 million Americans leaving, what some of my colleagues, Mike Graham and Jim Davis, have described as the Great Dechurching, is that a lot of people left out of a distrust or frustration with the church, or simply the conditions of modern life that made the church seem irrelevant, or just another thing that they didn't want to have to add into their lives. The thing is, when you come down a couple more generations, or a generation or two to Gen Z, they're not necessarily reacting against the church because they don't necessarily have an experience in the church, nor do they see the church as some sort of big bad authority because they didn't grow up in a time of Christendom when the church was any kind of authority. So this very skepticism that we're describing of authority doesn't necessarily apply to the younger generations in the same way toward the church. So it's something that they may want to try because the other institutions of their lives, whether it be the breakdown of family, distrust of educational institutions, distrust of other authorities through the experience of COVID, perhaps their churches, perhaps the medical profession, whatever they want to say about that, whatever skepticism, that actually could in many ways incline them toward more interest to say, well, gosh, if I can't trust these people who were telling me that religion is not the solution, then perhaps I should be investigating what these religions have to say. Maybe I should be giving another look at this. So we know that generations, they have a lot of respect for groups that come before, that they look up to their parents in many cases, they look up to their grandparents. Yet at the same time, generations tend to want to do things differently. Well, if Gen Z wants to do things differently, one of the most obvious things they can do is go to church.
Right.
That's an act of rebellion against a lot of their parents.
That's really funny. Yeah, I remember years ago a guy saying, I listen to my music really loud. My kids are always telling me, turn it down, Dad.
That's right.
maybe they'll rebel and turn out to be very preppy.
Yes, right.
But yes, so in an environment like this, and I think I see what you're seeing as well. I do interact with a lot of churches. I attend a church that's recently added a fourth service on Sundays because they're filled with young people.
Yeah.
This is just happening within the last few weeks. And in Colorado Springs, a lot of the young people are in the military. So, but that's an interesting dynamic as well.
Right.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the different essays here. And, we use the term cultural apologetics, and it's often described as kind of a pre-evangelism. Mm-hmm. Let's take some of these young people who are now coming to church, and this is maybe a form of rebellion, or I don't see what's so bad about this. In fact, I kind of like it, or I'm making friends here. I found my tribe. But now they want to turn around and enter the story of a culture. And I'm thinking of the way Trevin Wax puts this. They want to enter the story of a culture. They want to be able to communicate truth to their peers, but they don't, they're still learning about the gospel themselves.
Yeah.
I'm just curious to have you comment on that.
Yeah. Well, there's actually a project that we're working on now. It's called Making Sense of Us. It's a 7-week curriculum that's focused on young adults. And one of the difficulties that you often face in any audience, but especially with young adults, is that you're trying to, as a Christian, evangelize. You're trying to help introduce them to Jesus. But at the same time, you're trying to help edify Christians. You're trying to disciple them. Young adults have that eagerness. They have that desire to learn. They have a humility in many cases, maybe a naivete too, but a humility to say, I don't have everything figured out. I'm not completely set in my ways. And even as Christians, they hear a lot of other messages out there, messages about the meaning of progress, messages about the meaning of happiness, the meaning of identity, what we describe as cultural narratives. They are stories that we are living by. They're shaping us even when we don't know them. In fact, the most powerful stories are the ones that we don't even have to consciously repeat to each other because we just assume them. We just take them for granted. So, for example, in that series, Trevin Wax, you mentioned there, he talks about progress and scientific progress, this sense that we are always moving toward a more enlightened time. Things are always getting better. We are always getting smarter. We're always sort of conquering and taking over the existing world, the natural world. That's just human progress. The problem there, though, is I think in many ways, younger generations are the most skeptical of that. I mentioned COVID earlier. I think and I'm not trying to make any sort of political statement here at all. I'm just observing a broad-based skepticism toward all kinds of different authorities, which include a lot of medical authorities that I'm not sure that I can really trust what they're having to say to me right now. And then that also connects back to things like, well, what if there's a major consequence for the environment? What if human progress is not necessarily good for this world? So there's a lot of just assumptions that are being made that younger generations naturally are skeptical toward. And then all of a sudden, you're trying to think, okay, is there a better story? As I consider this cultural narrative, if I consider that progress is always happening and it's always good, but as I look around, I'm not sure that that's actually the case. I'm actually pretty skeptical about that. Well, then is there a better story to tell? And that's where we can come in, both evangelizing and edifying, both encouraging Christians, helping to disciple them, but also to help others to be able to show that, well, the Bible actually tells a story of an incredible of progress toward a goal, a time where things are going to be better one day in Jesus, but only He can come and make all things new. So in the meantime, we care for this creation. In the meantime, we care for our bodies. In the meantime, we give thanks for medical advances, but we recognize that every single one of those will fall short. But Christ's return is sure, and we can be completely confident in that. Once again, going back to the Augustinian sense, the world is wasting away, and yet inwardly we're being renewed day by day by the Spirit, who then testifies about the return of Christ to come. So that's what we try to do in different projects at the Keller Center with this book, The Gospel After Christendom, and then in this Making Sense of God curriculum, or Making Sense of Us, curriculum, is to help expose these stories to Christians and non-Christians, and then show them an even better story that the gospel tells.
Collin, if we were to go into a college campus and you were to meet some of these young adults who are skeptical, and again, we understand it's a skepticism. It's a kind of a skepticism. It's kind of a naivete. It's there's sort of this victim versus perpetrator mindset, right, that encompasses everything. How would you begin the conversation of what you just talked about?
Yeah. I really go back to something I've seen a lot of other people do, and pretty successfully. When you're talking about this kind of pre-evangelism and cultural apologetics, it really starts with helping people to doubt their doubts. Yes. So anybody can sound smart and sound intelligent by parroting a few things that they've heard that explain why they don't have to investigate Christianity.
Okay. Great.
So they're just reacting to something like that. The mode that you do not want to be in as a Christian is constant defense, of constant like, well, okay, you have this objection, then this objection, then this objection, and this objection. Because the problem is you realize that a lot of these objections are not even deeply held. They're surface level. They're simply just deflecting back. They're deflecting. The only way to get around it is to engage on their level about what they affirm. And then when you're engaging them of what they affirm as opposed to simply what they reject, as they are making these affirmations, then you become the skeptic in some ways to say, on what basis? Where do you get that idea? How can you defend that idea? And then what you'll usually find in those cases is they'll retreat back into well, that's just the way I think it is. Or that's just my truth. That's just what I think in there. But see, the problem there is that is a completely impossible way for us to live as a society. And so then you recognize that we, young adults will feel this especially, we are in an absolutely impossible situation, which is a combination of relativism and moralism. We simultaneously want to say, you do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. Like, you are free to do whatever you want. Also, you better do all the right things, because if you don't, we are going to cancel you. If you have the wrong job, or if you make the wrong amount of money, or you say something to the wrong person, or you're the wrong color skin, or you're the wrong gender, or you have the wrong views on this, then you're totally getting canceled. So somehow we are simultaneously in a new moralistic era that at the same time wants to present itself as completely relativistic. Anything goes. When you can help somebody to understand the inherent impossibility of being able to live that way, then you can help them to see that Christianity offers not only a solution, but the only solution to this. So it starts with doubting the doubts. It starts with not being on the defense, but in fact just asking questions and then trying to interrogate those assumptions and helping get down to the bottom of, how are we supposed to live if we all have to be moral? We all do our own thing at the same time. How do you do that individually? How do we do that as society? So that's the kind of progression that I typically walk through with people.
That's great, Collin. I love that. I'm thinking of the way a good story develops in a movie. You don't ignore the tension. You acknowledge it. You create it. You even amplify the tension so that people are invested in the solution that ultimately arises.
Yeah.
I love the way you phrase that about, there is kind of this relativism with this weird, you can do whatever you want, but if you don't do what we say, then.
And it's a kind of moralism that it's simply asserted. It's not defended. It's simply asserted.
Yes.
And ultimately, in the end, it becomes a power game. And if you help people to see that whatever moves people are making right now, whether it's oppressor or oppressed, all of it is a pretty cynical power game in the end. At least if you can get people to admit that. Some people will say, oh, yes, absolutely, I get it. It's just about who's in power, and I want that power. That at least defangs some of it. Some of other people will say, oh, I didn't actually realize that's what I was participating in right here. So you've mentioned a couple times the powerful versus the aggrieved dynamic that we see framed so much, the weak versus the strong. There's a lot to work with on that one, and especially to help realize that in the end, it's really just another power play. That's all it is.
We did a poll on Israel last year, and we said, so given Israel's military power and wealth, do you think that their cause against Hamas is unjust? And the majority of young adults said, yeah, I think it's unjust. Then we said, given the fact that Hamas leaders have become wealthy, skimming international aid that was designed for destitute Gazans, do you think their cause is unjust? And the exact same people said yes. Yeah. So they're in the streets, taking pictures of themselves at the Palestinian protests, but at the same time, they recognize that the group that's actually benefiting from that defense is also unjust.
Yeah, you can accuse Israel of genocide and then just ask, what would Hamas do to Israel if Hamas were in charge?
Right.
I mean, all you have to do is just ask them and look at what they've said. It's pretty explicit of what they want to do. So that's what I mean. I mean, I think October 7th, 2023, those Hamas attacks was in many ways a turning point, because Israel is the exact example of a place that you don't know where to fit them in that oppressor-oppressed dynamic. Because on the one hand, there's no group of people through history, and certainly through the Holocaust, which is the ultimate epitome of all of this, that has more of a claim to be oppressed. Yet at the same time, with those dynamics today, they're framed very much as an oppressor. Well, then you had the Hamas attacks come in, and it wasn't like some sort of full frontal attack on the Israeli military or something like that, but you're targeting innocent, left-leaning, in many cases, young adults at a music festival. Mm-hmm. Well, how does that add up? All of a sudden, they're the oppressed again. I think that's thrown a lot of people into a lot of confusion, and I think that exact dynamic has opened up a lot of the interest that I see among young people in campuses, because it was a paradigm that was falling. It's similar to the paradigm, I keep going back to it, but the paradigm of trust in a lot of institutional authorities that a lot of young people experienced. Again, it could have been their teachers, their administrators, it could have been any number of people in 2020 and 2021. Those are destabilizing and discouraging in so many different ways, but as Christian apologists and evangelists, they're also opportunities, because they make people think, they make people reflect, they make people look for something better. And that's what we have in the gospel.
This is great. That's a really powerful observation, because you think about this, it can't last forever.
No,
the entire world is the oppressors versus the oppressed.
Right.
You know, that at some point you've got to look at actual people and realize that it's not going to work. I wanted to get back to some of the essays in here. Christopher Watkin, a lot of people agree or disagree with him on different things, but he's a beautiful writer. And he says that the Bible itself is the apologetic. Yeah. That the creation, fall, redemption, consummation narrative, if we understand that framework, then our apologetic is, oh no, this is the story of reality. Yeah, right. How do you make that case to people who aren't sure there is a story of reality?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, as Christians, we affirm this is the story of stories. And you mentioned earlier movie films. You could recognize a couple different options here. Movies don't really make sense to us and resonate. Stories don't really make sense and resonate with us unless they follow that basic biblical paradigm. Now, if you think, okay, well, that can't possibly be the case. Well, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is that let me just think about the other different ancient Near Eastern stories. The gods are capricious. They're just like us, only way worse. They create out of the most lewd and crude activities you could imagine. Then everything is chaos, and there isn't really any right or wrong. There's just power. And in the end, a lot of the bad guys win. Mm. Okay, I mean, that isn't exactly something that resonates with us, but if you want to go back to ancient Babylon or ancient Persia or different places, you can see other stories. The biblical story is not the only one that's ever been proffered out there, but it's the one that resonates with us because ultimately it's the true story. It's the one that made the world that we inhabit now. Now, there is a challenge coming in because there is an attempt to be able to kind of mesh a postmodern aesthetic, which would be the main skepticism toward any sort of dominant narrative, any sort of dominant story, including the biblical story. But see, now that's becoming challenged by a new kind of meta-narrative, forming a meta-modern aesthetic where now there's everything everywhere all at once, and it's both sincere and skeptical at the same time. That's an interesting change-up to this basic story paradigm, but ultimately it leads to chaos. It's like what you have in art, where you have a standard of art, and then somebody offers a sort of a twist on that, or a rejection or a challenge to that. That's kind of interesting. But then when you get one step further and there's no standard anymore, all of a sudden now the art is just chaos. You have no idea what people are doing anymore. You have no idea to be able to evaluate the quality of art. That's similar with the stories. If we have one story, then a change up in that story can be interesting a little bit. But then when there's absolutely no story at all, we feel chaos. We feel disjointed. We feel like, wait a minute, if there's no happy ending, wait a minute, then all I'm doing here in this life is am I just waiting to die? What happens to me? So it's deeply ingrained in us to want something more. and yet to not think about it necessarily because we want to do our own thing. But really, in the end, it's that story that gives us some sense that we're going somewhere, that there's meaning to what we're doing, that there's hope possibly in the end. Because without that, it's very difficult to live. And that's why you see so many different skeptics major skeptics through history have realized, I don't think I can live through this. You see them commit suicide. You see them despair of life when you get away from that one story that makes sense of everything. Mm. So that's kind of a complicated way to look at it, but ultimately it's just helping people to realize that we want that story to be true, even if we don't quite understand it. That's something that Pascal said back in the day.
Yeah, one of the things with our students that we talk about is it at least plausible that history is going somewhere and it's going there on purpose, and that somehow we have been designed to be people who bring order out of chaos. Mm-hmm. If you can get to that, then it doesn't just change what you think about, it changes how you think about all the things that you think about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, I mean, it gives meaning to our everyday actions. It gives meanings to our hope, to our aspirations, to our dreams. But without some assurance there, then all of that's a mirage. And that's why you've seen, again, many people throughout history say it is a mirage. And then you realize that's not livable. It is not livable to think that we all just live in the matrix and nothing matters. You want to fight against the matrix and overcome it and to restore reality.
Yes, exactly. So good. I didn't want to run out of time before we talk about Sam Chan's essay on Acts 17. You know, this is really an interest. This is one of my favorite passages, starting in verse 16, where the Apostle Paul was in Athens waiting for people, and he was talking about the gospel of Jesus in the synagogues with the Jews and with those who worship God, as well as in the marketplace every day, and even engaged with the Epicureans and Stoics.
Yeah,
those are two groups of philosophers that I recognize still being active in
today?
Our world today. Yeah,
absolutely.
No question. Yeah, people who are primarily pleasure seekers, people who are primarily, everything is one, sort of a new spiritualist, what we call new spirituality here.
Right.
So let's talk. What does it look like for, describe that model first of all. What was the Apostle Paul doing in Athens? What was his approach? Yeah. And, I'm asking you to kind of talk about it yourself, but also comment on the way Sam Chan approached it. And then I want to see if we can maybe use that as a model for how we ought to interact with people. You know, when we're recording this, we're coming up on holidays. Yeah. Traditionally a tricky time for families to have conversations about tough things.
Yeah. Well, I like to think about Sam's chapter here in the Gospel After Christendom along with this new Making Sense of Us curriculum, because in that curriculum, he talks about the cultural narrative of happiness. And it's really an application of what he's laying out in that chapter of that methodology. And he talks about how we're made to be happy. It's a great thing. We celebrate that as Christians. And by the way, that's a little bit different from the Stoics. So now you're going to sound a little bit more Epicurean. We're made for pleasure. Okay, well now, it's a little bit like Montaigne. They're a little bit like the Epicureans there. But then the way you subvert the Epicureans and then you kind of bring in a Stoic element is by saying, but have you heard of things like the hedonic fallacy? The more and more and more you get of something pleasurable, the less pleasure it delivers to you. Mm-hmm. Now, we know this for a lot of different reasons. We know this from things like illicit drugs. You can't get the same high off the same hit. It starts to fade over time. That's the element of going after something in happiness that is not ultimately fulfilling. You'll keep going after and just think about getting older. The things that brought you that brought you pleasure, that brought you meaning, that helped you to kind of cope with life when you were younger, they don't work the same way when you're older. So then, turn around and you're looking at the Stoics. This is, again, just kind of an application in some ways of what Paul is trying to do, because he was running often between those two different worlds, whether it was earlier the Jews and the Greeks, but then later the Epicureans and the Stoics. You recognize, though, that the Stoics have this sense that we can essentially, we can overcome everything merely through our mental framework. We can overcome everything through discipline, through understanding, through control, self-control. But of course, there's always one great defeater to Stoicism, and that is that you can't stop death. It's not remotely possible. You cannot stop the ultimate degradation in there. And then where you're left with the Stoic is the question of, well, what happens after death? Now, a lot of people today, and I don't know exactly how to deal with this, a lot of people seem very content today to be able to say, either I don't know anything about the afterlife, or there is no such thing as an afterlife. They're more adept to just go with the Stoics and say, yeah, nothing really matters there at all. But let's go back again. But what if we're made for pleasure? What if we're made for happiness? What if we're made for relationships? Why would God allow those things? Why would life be worth living if all those things just go away? What if we never see people we love again? What if it just all ends? How can we actually be happy if we know that eventually it's just all gone anyway? Then it's just kind of a trick. It's kind of a cruelty that this life plays on us to think that any happiness is meaningful in there. So then you come back and say, maybe, as Lewis would have argued very clearly, maybe we're made for another world. Maybe we're made for something more. So I think that's a model of what Sam is trying to do, of everyday cultural apologetics, how he's trying to apply that to happiness as one example to help us to see what we're made for and who we're made for, and a way of adapting from Paul of how he's trying to, in Acts 17 and elsewhere in his ministry, he's trying to say, you have heard it said, this is Jesus too, right? You've heard it said from these people, you've heard it said from these people, now I tell you, kind of similar to Jesus, the Pharisees, the Sadducees. They've said this, and I tell you this. So the word is what gives us that confidence, and Paul shows us how we deliver that word through the instability of the other options that we try to give ourselves.
I love the way the Apostle Paul in that circumstance uses the culture as a platform from which to proclaim the gospel. Mm-hmm. And I love the way the narrative ends, because a lot of people left that conversation ridiculing him because of the teaching about the resurrection from the dead. Right. But some followed him.
So they wanted to hear more.
They wanted to hear more. The people at the Areopagus wanted to hear more. And some of them, that's like right. Dionysius and others, said, "I'm with you on this. I think you've got the right approach. Let's hang out." Yeah. So, man, that's an important realization, that if the Apostle Paul finishes a sermon, and some people are like, "Nah, you're an idiot," we shouldn't feel too bad if our attempts to engage the culture don't turn out the way we expect.
Yeah, you get into a lot of trouble in apologetics and evangelism if you judge your faithfulness based on the responses. Because if you do that, you'll ultimately want to manipulate the language to be able to elicit a certain kind of response. And there's a very big difference between the way Jesus and Paul taught differently to different audiences, but they also kept the same message, versus changing the message for different audiences. So sometimes people think that cultural apologetics is all about making the gospel more palatable, making it easier for people. We do believe that it's helping to make it easier for people to understand. But in as many ways cultural apologetics is often clarifying the offense of the gospel. It's clarifying, no, I don't think you understand just how offensive this is. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And really confronting, like you said earlier, you're raising the tension. So people often assume that when you're trying to contextualize, you're doing cultural apologetics, that people think that you're lowering the tension to make it easier to believe. Well, yes, you are clearing away a lot of objections, but in some ways you clear out the easier objections to expose the harder objections, the harder barriers to belief, more like the way Jesus talked to the rich young ruler, as an example.
Man. Well, this has been a great conversation, Collin. Thank you. I always love learning from people who are working on really, really hard things and trying to understand, what do you do in a culture like ours? Clearly, giving up is not an option. No. Clearly, just submitting to the fact that, we're in post-Christendom, it's not easy anymore. Well, you know what? Maybe it was never supposed to be easy. Yeah. maybe you were using the easiness as a way to coast rather than as a platform from which to be a blessing to the nations of the earth. Maybe we need to get back to what's most important here. So holidays coming up. I did mention that the show's going to come out right about that time. Give us some of your thoughts. Is there a way to have conversations like this in a positive way around the dinner table or when people are hanging out?
Well, young or old, I think the same truth applies. People like people who take an interest in them, who ask them questions, who are patient listeners, who ask good follow-up questions. People tend to resist the pontificators. And I think one of the challenges for young adults especially, and students, is that we get so full of new things that we've learned that we're just so eager to be able to share them. And they've opened up our mind, and we're so eager for other people to have their minds opened as well, that we just pontificate. We just start, and we can't understand why other people wouldn't understand us and wouldn't agree with us. But what if we all, young and old, what if older people on the holidays took the initiative to ask younger people questions and followed up with questions, maybe even follow up with some probing questions in there, but genuinely wanted to learn? What if younger people asked the older people, their family, their friends, their neighbors, and others, questions about what they've learned, about their wisdom, of their reflections on life, things like that? If we had more questions and less pontificating, I think probably we'd have some better holidays.
I love that. I was reading yesterday a book, and he said, look, there are 3 steps. Step number 1 is listen. Step number 2 is ask questions. And step number 3 is listen.
And if they ask you questions, you've got an opportunity there. And usually people do. Yeah. But yes, the longer you listen, I mean, the more wisdom you're perceived to have, whether you have it or not. You're more perceived. That's proverbial right there. You keep your mouth shut, you ask questions, people find you very wise.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. One of our sayings here at Summit Ministries is, you need old people. Yeah, and they need you. Yeah. And in many ways, I mean, you're a younger guy than I am, but still, calling you and asking questions, getting some insights from your experience. If we make that our habit, then we can become wiser people, more tuned into the tricky things that are happening in the culture, and then leave people really thinking about the gospel of truth. Amen. Collin, thanks so much for your time.
Oh, I really appreciate it. Great questions.
Thank you to my guest, Collin Hansen, for coming on the show. You can visit thegospelcoalition.org to find more of Collin's resources, as well as the information on this video course that he mentioned, Making Sense of Us. This podcast is a resource of Summit Ministries. We come alongside the rising generation, their trainers, parents, and influencers, so that young adults may know God's truth and become champions of a biblical worldview. If you want to learn more about Summit Ministries programs or access the resources that we have to help the rising generation embrace and share the truth that changes everything, just visit summit.org. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.